Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Morgan, and I am here in cooperation with World of Elex to provide another long overdue update video on the development of Elex from Piranha Bytes. We haven't made one of these videos in a while, and I do apologize, but in the past couple weeks we have had some very substantial previews that give us a lot of insight into some of the new developments of this game, and so it should go without saying that this video is going to be filled with a lot of spoilers for the story, for gameplay, and all sorts of things. So if that's something you're trying to go in blind with, then definitely ignore this video. But if you're only looking to avoid story spoilers, I'll have a little disclaimer over this video when I'm discussing the story section, and you can tune in once that disappears when we get into the gameplay side of things. Now, we have a lot of information to go over today, and I'm trying to keep this as short as possible, so I will keep the speculation down as much as I can, and mostly just stick to the facts. So why don't we get started straight away with information on the story, setting, factions, and all that sort of thing. Now, just for the record, most of the information we're gathering here and most of the image that you see is gathered from a preview by German YouTuber Gronkh, who actually was able to sit down with Bjorn Pankratz of Piranha Bytes to show off the first 3 hours or so of the game. So the game begins in a heavily forested region known as Eden, which is home of the Berserkers, and previous alpha and pre-alpha videos took place in a lightly wooded zone, a neutral zone called Abessa, which we do not see again in this game. But my friend Ravenhearth has compiled some images we've seen of the map into a mostly completed global map showing each faction zone. Eden seems to be the southernmost part of the map, with Abessa due north and the desert of Tavar directly east. You can also see parts of the volcanic region and the frozen region of the Alps in the far north, but unfortunately the player does not get to see these areas in the game just yet, so this is something that we're still unenlightened on so far. The player character named Jax is a high-ranking Alb commander, as we've learned previously. He is sent on an apparently highly important mission, which the details of are undisclosed from the start of the game, but we learn a bit more about this from a later NPC. And it's suggested by Jenny in the forums that the details of his missions are part of the mystery to be unveiled as the main quest goes on. And his mission begins very poorly, with his glider being shot down and crashing in the mountains. And it appears that his fall was an act of betrayal, as NPCs in the intro appear to be Albs, including a man named Elex wearing a hood, who seems to suggest that simply by crashing his glider, Jax's mission was a failure, although these comments may be facetious, as Elex seems to have a more ulterior motive up his sleeve. And it's interesting to wonder what this implies for the supposedly emotionless Albs, who you would think would not be prone to that sort of ambition, betrayal, or even wisecracking like we see from him. Another interesting thing to note, which was observed by my friend Ravenhearth, is that those firing the rifles that shut down the glider do not appear to be the Albs that show up. If you look closely, the hands holding the rifle do not appear to be wearing the same armor as the Alb soldiers that show up afterwards. So as Jax regains consciousness, it's interesting to note that he seems more self-aware on awakening than I really expected earlier. And it seems really odd to play a character with a defined history that he already knows, but we as the player simply are not allowed to know about right away, and it's something that develops later. For me personally, it's something of an immersion breaker. I had originally assumed that amnesia would be a side effect of Elex withdrawal, and that uncovering the mystery of Jax's origins and his mission would be sort of a personal motivation for our character as well, but it seems that he knows a lot more about himself, and we just have to kind of figure it out as we go on. As far as the Albs that shot him down, a short dialogue with an NPC later suggests that this character is part of a known group of Alb betrayers known as the Separatists, who are operating in the area. And how well known these Separatists are is a little unclear. We don't know who leads them and whether the Albs even know who their members are, but it seems pretty clear that Elex is operating as one of them, and the character insists that they still operate as Albs even if they don't follow their directive anymore. So whether they are outlaws, renegades, or what, that's just something we don't quite know yet. Another dialogue with a later NPC explains that the Albs do not tolerate failure and immediately execute their operatives who fail an objective. And Calyx, being on the scene so quickly, suggests that he must be a separatist, which would lend more credence to the revenge motivation of Jax, because I cannot imagine that a high-ranking Alb just happened to be in the area where Jax crashed and was there to summarily execute him immediately. Seems a little sketchy to me. So after all this, I went ahead and questioned Jenny Pankratz in the forums on why Jax's first declaration with his newly experienced emotions is to simply get revenge on Calyx. He doesn't seem to be that perplexed about anything else he's experiencing. And Jenny replied that the uncertainty caused by his unfamiliar emotional experiences made him angry and confused, and he still wants to return to the Albs and hopes to regain his status with them and might seek help from former enemies just in order to get there. And it is possible that just by experiencing these new emotions, that does not necessarily wash away his old prejudices while he was an Alb. So he still sees all these factions as an enemy and simply a means to an end. And withdrawal effects from Elex are supposedly lethal and supposedly have major personality changes, but honestly, Jax seems barely fazed by them, and I find that a little confusing. So as Jax awakens, he learns that his gear was looted by a mysterious NPC who, at first it seemed like he also healed him, but I find this doubtful. The character seems to be an outlaw, as explained by an NPC later, and tracking him down may be a part of our objectives later. We get a couple glimpses at some Alb technology, most importantly the smartwatch kind of device that's implanted in Jax's left arm, with a projected display that can be generated through armor, and all this kind of acts as a Pip-Boy style management system with a data log, inventory, map, and all that kind of thing. Another Alb technology we see is something called the Crony, which seems to be a kind of hovering drone that acts as a scout of sorts assigned to an Alb operative. It seems that Jax had a couple of these assigned to him, and one that we find later actually unveils a lot of interesting information. We see that plenty of the old ruins in this area are still powered. They still have the lights on and machinery working and everything, and who is maintaining them while they appear vacant, we don't really know. It's a little unusual. At some point, Jax tries to sneak up on a character and cast a spell on him, but it appears to have failed since the fight went very poorly. And it is possible that this spell is Elex powered, and his withdrawal from the substance has kind of ruined his abilities. So he finds a berserker named Duras, who apparently decides to help him after an attempt to ambush him fails. And he offers to lead him to the berserker capital called Goliath, with a stop on the way to a camp of clerics that he spotted earlier. And it is noteworthy that it's totally possible to ignore him after this first dialogue and start your adventure on your own. Duras expresses suspicion in regards to Jax's identity, but simple dialogue options seem to convince him, and it's unusual how trusting he is, since Jax speaks with a very belligerent tone at first. It seems that Duras can be taken on as an ally later, suggesting that he becomes a standard party member similar to the companions in Risen 2 and 3. And he also has a quest for the character to cooperate with, and asks him to find 5 murder suspects on behalf of the Berserkers, and requests that Jax helps him. And this quest is acquired from speaking to him back in town later, whether he leads you there or not. And this seems to be a long-term quest requiring travel to several other zones, possibly as a way to get the player some exposure to all the other clans. The Berserkers, as I said, are centralized in a capital called Goliath, or at least specifically, this seems to be the headquarters of a clan called the Fog Crows. We hear about a couple different clans, including the Hammer and Iron clan, who the relationships between the clans do not really seem clear just yet, but Jenny implies in the forums that the other clans inhabit their own locations, so most, if not all, of the Berserkers we see in this preview seem to be of the Fog Crow variety. They live in mostly wooden thatch houses, but the capital is commanded from the ruins of a more modern-looking building, something like a hotel it seems to be. Their leader is a warlord named Ragnar, who seems to be the de facto leader, not the supreme ruler, while their master Thorald is on pilgrimage, and his leadership right now seems to be a bit rocky, as his men seem to ignore his orders and don't necessarily take him too seriously. Which reminds me, funnily enough, of Francis from Gothic 2 Night of the Raven.
And he left me in command. I'm the captain here.
One thing that the Berserkers are known for is their ability to render Elex into a substance they call mana, which is used not only for casting spells, but also for regrowing and purifying the natural world via their world hearts, a massive organic structure that seems to fertilize the devastated earth and has basically created the whole forest of Edan all over again. So as such, one of the key landmarks in Goliath is a mana shrine where Elex is collected and converted into mana. And mana is a collectible substance as opposed to a personal stat, so it's something you can acquire and pick up throughout the game, and is apparently used in casting Berserker spells and in their terraforming efforts. But how it works as a gameplay function, if it's a consumable to restore your mana or equivalent energy source, we just didn't really get a chance to see that. Outside of Goliath is a massive trash heap that includes all sorts of assorted machinery that they ripped from the buildings in the area, and disposing of this seems to be part of their commitment to renounce technology, but they only do this after ripping all the Elex out of these machines. It is noteworthy that none of the Berserkers in the town seem to really offer any stern opposition to the player character's use of technology, which realistically wouldn't really make sense since some of his technology, such as his user interface, is embedded into his body, so getting rid of it isn't really possible. And presumably the characters, the Berserkers, understand that conversion to their purest cause cannot always be forced, so they kind of need to accept help from people who are not as dedicated to their purest ways as they are. But it is curious that none of them seem to suspect that his advanced technology, such as his smartwatch and his jetpack, seem to tie him to the Alps. A group of dead clerics that you stumble across with Duress left notes behind suggesting that they send missionaries out to other factions to convert others in order to expand their influence and their access to resources. And originally it was implied that the clerics are extremely militant and force people to conform to their ideology. Yet the notes by the clerics here seem to suggest that they're trying to do it more peacefully, as more of a missionary duty instead of a forced conversion. But nevertheless, the Berserkers do seem to be experiencing a violent conflict with these cleric groups, whom Duress suggests are looking for something in Edan, and the extent of the conflict is unclear, as the clerics seem to see the Berserkers as more peaceful and accessible than the other factions. But Duress implies that the volcanic area that the clerics hail from is a little too lacking in resources, and branching out and associating with other factions is their only chance at gaining food and natural resources that they require. We later on find one of the clerics of this group has actually survived and is undercover inside the Berserkers, and his name is Bertram. And strangely, he confesses his identity very quickly to you, even though he only just met you and has no idea how you even associate with the Berserkers just yet. Now, throughout the preview, we do find an item known as Elexit, or Elexit, however you care to pronounce it, which was previously identified as a form of currency, which is just small shards of Elex that have probably not been purified yet. But we also see that there are alternatives available in the form of cigarettes and toilet paper and other very luxury commodities. Bjorn states that these are an alternative form of currency, but we've yet to see how this works mechanically, whether it's through a bartering system. At some point, Bjorn goes into detail to explain the morality type system in this game a little bit more, and actions based on emotion or logic, which they refer to as coldness, will sway the meter one way or the other. And one is not necessarily more evil than the other. For example, murder would be considered an emotional act and will modify your status accordingly. But beyond just player actions, dialogue options can also influence it as well. We don't see the extent of gameplay impact that this meter really has, though. It's also interesting to note that individual characters, possibly just party members, but also possibly every character in the game, seems to have their own disposition meter towards you, and we see notifications popping up in dialogue similar to Telltale games, stating whether or not a character likes what you say, is going to remember it, or is offended by it. At some point, we see text found in the unique language used by both the clerics and the albs, and the same text was used in a lot of secret messages on Facebook posts as part of their publicity campaign. And it's hardly a complex language if you look at it. It's just each symbol is a replacement for a letter in the English alphabet. Even in the German version, curiously enough, it's directly translated to English. And one propaganda piece we see in the game declares our purity is Kalin's power. Kalin, of course, or Kalan, however they pronounce it, we haven't really heard yet, being the deity worshipped by the cleric faction. And this piece seems to condemn the corrupting influence of Elex consumption, and it actually uses a piece of fan art in an old contest that Piranha Bytes ran a while back, which contrasts a more pure utopia versus a monstrous dystopia that they claim is caused by the consumption of Elex as a drug. We also frequently find audio logs that seem to be personal diaries directly from people before the meteor strike. According to Bjorn and several other sources, the ending will depend not only on the chosen factions, but also other significant decisions you make through the game as well. And we've also already heard that there will be a free play mode after the game, so you can kind of see the consequences of the ending of the game and how your choices really affect things. Actually joining a faction seems like it might take a very long time in this game, and it's unclear if there's going to be a way to fast track it, sort of how Night of the Raven did it back in Gothic 2, and if it's necessary to visit all of the factions first. But Ragnar, the leader of the Berserker faction, sends the player on a mission to spy on all the other factions, suggesting that it is in fact a requirement to join. So it is implied that Piranha Bytes wants the player to visit all the factions and get exposure to them all before he picks one to join. But from a story standpoint, it's interesting, it's curious that Ragnar would trust a stranger for this very important mission, and why the conditions of joining their faction are so steep, considering they seem to be, you would think that they would be eager to take on new help. So far, it's still unclear whether there's any cooperation possible remaining with the Albs. This uncertainty is exacerbated by a crony drone that Jax finds with a functioning AI that continues to cooperate with Jax in spite of the mission failure, even as it observes that failing the mission is considered grounds for immediate termination by the Albs. When Jax meets this crony, he sends it to a predetermined location for repairs. Why this crony is still cooperating with him, considering even it recognizes that he is now a renegade. It's possible that the crony is assigned to Jax himself and is not bound to the Master Alb directives, so it can continue to help him. The crony, U4, in this particular case, explains that the intended mission objectives of Jax was to find the Berserker leader Thorald and learn not only the faction's weaknesses, but also try and discover a way to reverse modify mana back into Elex. So it seems that Elex is understood to be a finite resource if the Albs consider it a high enough priority to try and undo the modifications done by the Berserkers. Mana is supposedly really bad for the Albs, and they are forced to avoid the World Hearts, according to a statement by Jax later on, but the details are not really explained too thoroughly. But this could explain why hostile action has not really been taken against the Berserker encampments yet, since it could very well be that the Albs can't go near the mana shrines protecting them. Throughout the land as you explore it, we see numerous outlaw encampments in the wilderness, and many of them seem to conflict with the local factions and even with each other. At some point, we see a couple bandits attack another outlaw that we can talk to, but most of the bandit camps seem to be directly hostile with you. It's unknown whether it's possible to interact with these hostile groups at some point, or if they're permanently hostile. For example, if you join the outlaws, can you cooperate with these guys, or are they just going to be hostile no matter what? It would be interesting if there is actually unique dynamics to how factions interact with each other. So, for example, that bandits are permanently hostile unless you join them, whereas cooperation with the Berserkers is much more amicable. So that just about wraps up everything we've learned over the last couple weeks in terms of the story and the setting, but most importantly, confirmed by Jenny in the forums as well as at the end of Gronkh's 4th video. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Jack the Lighthouse Keeper is confirmed. So, quite frankly, if there's anything you need to take away from this video, I think that is it. Alright, so that takes care of all the story and setting information we learned from this preview video. And we're going to hop right into gameplay and features to go over my observations and statements in terms of gameplay functions. First thing to observe is that the heads-up display seems a lot more streamlined and less intrusive than it did in the alpha and pre-alpha builds. But certain pop-up notifications such as jump and the so-called parade mode, as well as object and character highlights, still kind of grab the attention, but it is supposed to be possible to disable them in the menu. Among other pop-up indicators are a low stamina indicator and a low jetpack fuel overlay on the player, and it is actually, in my opinion, quite nice to see this, so you don't have to constantly pay attention to meters in the corner of the screen to understand how your resources are being managed. Now, everything in the HUD seems to disappear except for the quick select bar when your weapon is sheathed, so you don't have this clunky HUD just getting in the way the whole time while you're trying to take in the view. So that's nice to see. All of container looting seems to be done through the UI in the computer device on the arm, whereas looting corpses simply gathers all the items off the body, similar as it did in Risen 2 and 3. Good to know that the sneaking ability is available straight from the start, so it's not something we have to find an NPC and learn how to do. In my opinion, the combat animations still seem frustratingly slow, but this may just be early game balancing, and there may be abilities later that speed up your attack combos a little bit more. Interesting to note that it is not possible to do a 180-degree turn for an attack animation anymore just by focusing the camera on the enemy or moving in that direction the same way you would do in Risen 2 and Risen 3, for example. And speaking of that, attacks no longer propel you across great distances to the enemy anymore. So it's good to know that Piranha Bytes is moving away from the sort of Batman Arkham-style combat. And this, combined with the stamina meter, seems to severely punish button mashers, so taking careful consideration of your attacks is going to be very important. It's interesting to note, in terms of NPC AI, that when Duras switched from his bow to his melee weapon, he never seemed to use his bow again. And I'm not quite sure why that happened. It may have just been a bug, or it may have just been a permanent shift in the AI for some reason. But speaking of Duras's AI, it occasionally looks straight out of Gothic 3, as in many cases he totally ignored enemies taking a swipe at him as he ran, and in some cases just ran past all the enemies and left the player to die. But curiously, he would aggro on enemies that weren't even in his line of sight. So this seems to be something that continues to need some work, so hopefully Piranha Bytes can get this sorted out. There's a function known as parade mode, which is mostly a kind of blocking stance, I assume similar to Risen 2 and 3, and it might be combined with a lock-on feature like Risen 2 and 3 had it, although there does seem to be an independent lock-on defaulted to the button mapping X. Now, in this parade mode, it seems that blocking with a weapon does not mitigate 100% of damage anymore, although this may depend on stamina, and we have not seen how shields really modify this yet. Blocking does not work from behind, so there's no more Risen 3 kind of spider sense, as you can block attacks coming in all directions. And I haven't really seen yet if there's a Risen-style parry mechanic. The depth of skills and attributes available to the player have not really been disclosed yet. Now, heavy attacks seem to have unique animations this time around instead of just being a slower version of the default attacks. And the default controls for light and heavy attacks are different. Heavy attacks being bound to the input E on the keyboard, and probably other keys on the gamepad. And no idea what other controls may be available for combat just yet, such as special attacks enabled by the combo meter, which is something we unfortunately did not get the chance to see in Gronkh's preview. It seems like that's a mechanic he just did not have unlocked yet, but it is something we've seen in other previews where a small meter builds up as you perform well-timed combos, and it enables special attacks. It seems that attacks can be cancelled in mid-windup by dodging, so if you start an attack but are not following through just yet, you can dodge out of it to sort of feint, as it were. It may be possible that this costs additional stamina, but it's not exactly clear just yet. It would seem that stamina debt or negative stamina may be a thing in this game. It seemed to take longer to begin recovering stamina if an action fully depleted it. And another observation is that the blocking stance does not seem to slow stamina regeneration at all, not like it does in Dark Souls, for example. It does appear that stamina is going to be a massively limiting resource in this game, as all combat actions require everything from attacking to sprinting to blocking. And it obviously discourages button mashing, but this may make crowd control very frustrating, as you're engaging multiple enemies and your stamina runs out too quickly. Interesting to note that at some point with his starting weapon, the player actually did minimal to even no damage to certain enemies. Possibly this is going to be a return to the Gothic 1 mechanic where a weak player with a weak weapon could not even put a scratch on some of the tougher enemies. But they do still flinch from the impact, however. Good to know that dodging does not have the length of invincibility as it did in Risen 3, but seems somewhat more like the Souls franchise. Just a very brief window during the animation, and you can be hit before or after it. Also interesting to see that the backstep dodge is not a roll, but forward and sideways dodging does involve rolling. And it's also been stated by Jenny in the forums that heavier weapons will change the dodge animation, so using a supermassive weapon will actually change the animation to more of a quick step, and possibly is not as safe to use as the dodge roll with a lighter weapon. One of the things I observed but can't really quantify just yet is that getting hit during an attack or dodge does not seem to guarantee to stun yourself or your enemy and cancel the action that they were performing. Sometimes it does, so it's really unclear what the conditions are, if it has to hit before or after a certain point in the animation, for example, but I really just don't know yet. Firearms used by enemies, bows as well, seem to be mostly used as a countermeasure for the player's jetpack. That's mostly how we see it used in this preview. So, for example, if you're out of reach on an incline that the NPCs just can't find a way up to, they'll draw a ranged weapon and start laying down some firepower on you instead of running around to try and find a way to climb up. This happens regardless of your proximity to them. So if you're only on a ledge that's like 10 feet above their head, they're not going to keep running around trying to find a way up. They're just going to switch to their ranged weapon immediately. It's observed that different species of monsters will fight each other out in the wilderness, kind of like they did in in Gothic 1 and 2. So that's nice to see. It makes the wilderness look a bit more lively. As far as monsters are concerned, it's stated that single monsters on their own may roam aimlessly across a random path, while large packs can cover a large area and tend to patrol. The statements are a little unclear, but it's suggested by Bjorn that solitary monsters may respawn, but whole packs of them don't reappear unexpectedly. It's also suggested in other sources that I can't quite remember that between chapters we will see a lot of enemies respawn the same way they did in the early Gothic games. It is interesting to know that enemies seem to chase you a lot further than they did in previous games. There were places where it seemed like a full quarter mile they were still being pursued, but unfortunately they never seem to use this. They never seem to sprint to try and catch up to you, so getting away from them still seems to be a fairly trivial task. Now, getting into the controversial jetpack, it seems that platforming type navigation is pretty much trivialized by the existence of the jetpack, and that falls may never be lethal as long as you are crafty and using it. The fuel, which does recover on its own, is still very highly limited in the beginning, but it's enough to make most navigation a cakewalk. The recovery is pretty slow. This is likely in order to balance it in combat, so you can't just use it constantly. And it's mostly used for vertical travel, because horizontal movement with it is extremely limited. Now, we've heard a lot about how the crime system is going to work in this game, and we do see it in play in a couple of circumstances in this preview. Currently, it seems that NPCs who observe you committing a crime will try to kill you immediately. It's not really clear if this is going to happen in release or whether or not they'll just knock you down and report you. But running from these NPCs until they de-aggro seems to calm them. But once you return, they'll still be pissed off at you and won't necessarily interact with you straight away. We do see evidence of the bounty system at play. When the player was being chased by one NPC past another, the second NPC initially asked why they were chasing you to begin with before taking part in the manhunt themselves. A notification appears later on that the crime was reported, but it's curious to know that this notification had a long delay and seemed to wait until the NPCs chasing you made it back to their camp before your crime was reported. So it is actually possible that there is a witness kind of system similar to Skyrim. So if you manage to neutralize your pursuers, your bounty may never actually get reported to the leadership. But as far as a bounty is concerned, when you return to the town, nameless guards will try and direct you to their leader, although other NPCs may not even observe your crime. Low bounties supposedly do not make the faction hostile, but they will not trade with you, and it is possible that higher bounties will result in the faction becoming completely hostile. And we've also heard that they will actually send bounty hunters after you if your criminal reputation is high enough. Now there is some glitchiness with bounty system as it works in dialogue, because the player initially was able to have a totally ordinary conversation with the leader Ragnar, but only when he passed him later was he called out the second time for being a criminal and was ordered to pay up his penalty. It's an interesting observation that NPCs who are leading you somewhere will actually wait for you if you wander off, but we haven't seen if there's a distance cap before they just move on, but it definitely seems more generous than previous games, so you can actually move on and explore quite a bit without losing them. As far as NPCs are concerned, they are not immortal and may actually kill each other. We have been told that NPCs critical for the main story may be temporarily immortal if there's just no workaround for completing the main quest without them, but we've also been told that once their role is completed, they are no longer flagged as immortal, and you can kill them freely. It is possible that some kind of interfaction conflict may come to a head later on in the main story. This is just based on my own speculation, and it would be interesting to see if there are sort of takeover sequences similar to Gothic 3, but again, this is just pure speculation. There's really no information on this whatsoever. Now, as far as NPCs being able to kill each other, this does seem to have some game-breaking implications, but the only observed example of this happening was the player's fault. He led two hostile bandits back to a quest-giving NPC, and they killed him. Piranha Bytes has insisted multiple times that quests associated with dead NPCs can still be completed in other ways, so even if this happens to you, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Dialogue with NPCs in some cases seems to be really strict. You have to be very choosy about your dialogue selections, meaning you can miss out on quest completions and other options just by choosing poorly. I'm not so convinced on this, but a lot of people seem to like that your dialogue choices have some conviction to them. You can't just backpedal on a statement you make to somebody and have them just forget about it. But the observed example in this case is an NPC asked the player to turn over some items that they acquired earlier, and when the player refused, the NPC in turn refused to trade with them afterwards, and there's no way to backstep on that decision. So you couldn't just say, "Oh, I'm sorry about that. Here, take the stuff." It's once you said you weren't turning it over, it seems you were pretty much committed. Now, there aren't too many statements to be made on the buildings that we see just yet, but it is interesting to note that they seem to be deliberately designed with multiple entries, increasing stealth possibilities. So you don't just have to sneak in the front. Don't have to try and sneak in the front door if you're looking to do some kind of criminal shenanigans. We see that the player acquires more than one lockpick in the early game, suggesting that they are a consumable item again and not a permanent item that you acquire, such as in Risen 2 and 3. But the locking minigame has yet to be observed in any form that I've seen, and we've also heard of a hacking minigame for electronic systems that we have yet to see as well, so this is still a mystery to us. We see that stat requirements for weapons are back, so attributes such as strength and dexterity need to be improved to wield higher level weapons, which I'm glad to see because this was an important way to balance how easily you could acquire really powerful weapons early in the game. But we've also heard that looting weapons from fallen NPCs is still not going to happen in this game, which is kind of frustrating. Especially since this stat requirement is in place to make sure that you can't just you can't just sneak up and beat the crap out of an NPC to get a really good weapon early on. But that's just how it is. At some point, the player finds something called a small white stone, and Bjorn stated that this is an item for weapon upgrades, but we have yet to see or get a good explanation on how upgrading or crafting equipment is going to function in the game. We do see the player acquire other apparent crafting elements such as metal and electronic scrap. It seems that you can craft and upgrade more than just weapons. You might be able to get into other systems as well, but again, this is just speculation, so no confirmation on that just yet. Jenny in the forum stated that you will always find enough ammo in the game, but buying it will be expensive, so this seems to suggest that ammo scarcity is not intended as a way to balance firearms. So if you want to play a pure ranged build, that's very much possible, it seems like. The inventory system, as stated and as has been seen in every other game, is going to be completely unlimited, no weight or volume capacity at all. And both Bjorn and Jenny offered a fairly sarcastic explanation this time around, referring to Jax's inventory as a, quote, volume reduction backpack. Alright, so that takes care of all of our gameplay observations now. And just as a quick final bit to go over here, I just wanted to talk about the engine and the graphics, some more observations that we've seen owing to this latest preview video. So, Piranha Bytes has defended their decision not to use motion capture animations and instead rely on keyframe animations. And we see right off the bat how animations in cutscenes in particular go from Louis Spence to superhero walk on a dime, which is still pretty hilarious to watch in some of the cutscenes. But generally, the animations are better than anything we've seen from Risen or honestly from Gothic, for that matter. Gameplay animations in general are improved in some slight ways. They seem a bit smoother, more organic. Actual turning animations when moving from a standstill that we still don't see in many games today. And the attack combo animations interestingly are not static, so a combo can start with one of multiple swing directions instead of just being a repeated combo animation. The draw distance in the game is pretty nice in general, but the level of detail distance seems fairly short, and actually in one interesting case the camera pans out during a cinematic. It seems that the LOD is actually generated based on the character location, as texture detail right in front of the camera started to rapidly get worse as the camera panned out. Just a funny little oversight in the engine, I think. So far, it's a little unclear what stage of the build this is. This is likely the beta at this point, because the alpha and pre-alpha both had text on the top stating as such. And I assume that this is the beta build because they've stated they are still going through a very thorough bug-fixing phase right now. The lighting engine in the game seems vastly improved thanks to the DirectX 11 implementation. Shadows are very distinct and unlit areas are actually pitch black for a change. So you move into a really dark area with no light source and you're not going to be able to see. But it looks like there's some kind of vision transition after spending a short time in a dark area to improve visibility. This was used to some extent in Risen 2 and 3, and it seems deliberate, although interior lighting in these areas doesn't seem to change how the effect works. It's been noted that the grass on the ground in this gameplay preview does not seem to cast shadows like it does in many of the available screenshots. So whether this implies that these screenshots were taken with much higher detail options than the game will actually have, or whether it's just that the graphical options were not maxed out in this particular gameplay preview, don't really have an answer on that, I'm afraid. The lighting from the sun cast across the water in certain surfaces is actually pretty impressive, very distinct and beautiful looking, but most textures in general still seem to look pretty matte, unreflective, and fairly indistinct when it comes to the light reflections. The general foliage from the trees and the shrubs and everything seems to move a lot, but this, to me, appears to be just a static animation and is not terribly dynamic, because it just appears that there seems to be a very steady, constant breeze in this world, apparently. It is comforting to know that, in general, Piranha Bytes is relying less on deliberate landscape pathing and are making the terrain much more open and accessible, so there's no sticking to just sort of tunnel-like pathways between weirdly rocky territory that we unfortunately saw a lot of in Risen 2 and 3. It is very comforting to see that women in general in this game are presented a bit more modestly this time around. Not to mention that their animations actually fit their so-called skeleton for once, so there's no more awkward limbs twisting and warping like we've seen in almost every one of their other games. Very interesting to see that the environmental collision can be very precise, as the grand finale of this preview involved the player dying after falling between two beams on a roof while he was trying to escape pursuers with a jetpack. So that's actually got some very good implications for range combat, so we're not going to see projectiles hitting an invisible barrier 10 feet away from any visible obstacles. So that is very good to see. And last point to leave you off with is an interesting note from Jenny. A lot of people question why the last couple games have not had an available developer console to input commands and cheats and that sort of thing. And her statement is that they decided it just wasn't worth putting in anymore because for some reason, strangely, people would use it to break the game and then send them furious emails about bugs. So I'm sorry to say, but people ruined a good thing, and Piranha Bytes just got fed up with it, so they don't allow those tools to be used by us anymore. But maybe someone will figure out a way to enable it one way or another. But as far as that is concerned, we're just going to have to deal with it. So that pretty much wraps everything up. We've gone through everything from gameplay to story to the game engine and graphics, but one speculative statement that I want to leave you off on is that supposedly this game will not ship with any launch DLC, and is not planned. There is no paid DLC planned for this whatsoever. Whether that's subject to change or if that's a statement made with conviction is unclear. This information has only come from a preview by the website Cultured Vultures, who state that this is not going to ship with any paid DLC, and any DLC that comes up afterwards is going to be free. This statement has not been expressly made by either Piranha Bytes nor THQ Nordic, but this preview was shared by them specifically, so a lot of people are taking that to mean that that is an official statement endorsed by the developers and the publisher. So take it for what you will. I think we're just going to wait and see, because this game looks like it's going to be full of content and more than enough to keep us satisfied, whether or not there's DLC to go along with it. So that wraps up everything for me, my friends. Hope you all enjoyed and learned something today, and I apologize that I have not been able to make these sorts of videos as often as I used to. I'm a little strapped for free time these days, but as we get closer and closer to release, I will do my best to stay on top of information and cooperate with World of Elex some more to get you this information and take in as much available preview details as possible. So, if you enjoyed and learned something today, don't forget to subscribe to us at World of Elex, and also follow us on Facebook at World of Elex and in our forums at World of Elex to participate in discussions and stay up to date with it, all the new information that we acquire. So until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and have a wonderful night.